Not even 24 hours had passed since Brian Hooker walked out of that Bahamian police station, and he was already sitting down for interviews. He promised the cameras he would never lay a hand on his wife. He said Lynette was his entire world. He swore he'd never stop looking for her. Facing the press, he insisted he'd keep searching for Lynette at any cost, warning that only an authority far greater than his own could ever make him stop. What he never mentioned in any of those sit-downs was what really happened on that boat. Not on April 4th, but long before the tragedy ever unfolded. There were words spoken to Lynette Hooker aboard the Soulmate. Words her mother has finally decided to reveal. This case is built on those very words. If you're interested in true crime cases, analyzed with real depth, subscribe and hit the bell. That way you won't miss any updates on this or other open investigations. Before we dive into the details, one thing needs to be clear. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He was released without any formal counts. His attorney has gone on the record denying any involvement whatsoever. Even so, in the eyes of the law, he remains a person of interest. This investigation is still very much active. Nothing said here is a final judgment. Everything presented comes from official sources found within the public record. There is a very specific, demanding kind of lifestyle. One a couple has to surrender to completely once they decide to head out into the open sea. You don't do it halfway. It's a heavy gamble full of logistical and financial decisions that you simply cannot walk away from at a moment's notice. You say goodbye to a fixed address. No more car payments, no property taxes. And you leave behind all that furniture collected over decades in one place. You compress your whole existence until it fits without squeezing too hard into 14 meters of fiberglass wood and rigging. You learn to read the sky as if it were a second language. You prepare yourself to stay stocked with supplies, for weeks at a time. You spend more time with your partner in a claustrophobic space with fewer distractions or escapes than most married couples will ever experience on dry land. That was the life Brian and Lynette Hooker chose. They found their boat in Rockport, Texas. They spent months stripping it down and rebuilding it from scratch. They named her Soulmate. In March of 2023, they untied the lines in Key West for the Gulf mists, while Lynette filmed the departure for her followers. She stood on the bow with a wide, radiant smile, celebrating that they were finally leaving Key West after 4 long months of preparation. Behind her, Brian worked the lines, leading them both into the deep. That foggy departure was the birth of the Sailing Hookers, the name of their social media pages. What they documented over the next 3 years was quite frankly a dream. Caribbean islands, meals cooked in solar ovens in the boat's galley, laughing through heavy storms. The manatees Lynette would trail while snorkeling. Sea turtles she filmed gliding beneath the surface. That crisp, clean horizon that appeared again and again every single morning after a night at anchor. Lynette Hooker wasn't the kind of woman who just tagged along on a sailing trip to please her husband. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, made that very clear. She grew up near lakes, surrounded by boats. She'd been swimming and sailing since she was just a little girl. The water was her sanctuary. It was where she was truly herself. Those watching her videos could feel that authenticity. 2 people, with more than 20 years of marriage behind them, living completely outside the traditional system, pointing their cameras at something vast and bright, sending those images back to those of us on shore. Their life looked like the answer to a question we all ask. It felt like, for once, someone had actually figured it out, like they had done everything right. Her final video went up on March 9, 2026. It showed Lynette paddleboarding in the Bahamas, pointing out the wildlife swimming just beneath her feet. Her very last post was a single photograph, boats resting at anchor in the still, glassy waters of the Bahamas. The caption said they weren't moving for a while. It meant they were settled. It meant this is our home. Just a few days after that photo was posted, she vanished from those same waters. But here is what the videos never let you see. A lens only sees what you choose to put in front of it. 2 people documenting their lives at sea show exactly what they want, nothing more. There is a reverse shot. A version of that boat and that marriage that only existed when the cameras were dead, the version Lynette's daughter is now telling. It's the same story Lynette shared with a friend in text messages that have now been made public. And it's what her 76-year-old mother has now described, in a way that makes it impossible to look back. Someone on the inside knew the truth of what was happening. She's finally talking. And what she has to say Brian Hooker hasn't mentioned once since his release. You might already be familiar with the story Brian Hooker told the Bahamian authorities. But in this case, the specifics are everything, and it's worth going through them step by step very carefully. On the afternoon of April 4, 2026, Brian and Lynette Hooker left Hopetown in the Abacos on a small 2.5-meter rubber dinghy. They were heading for Elbow Cay, where their sailboat, the Soulmate, was anchored. Brian told police that the sea conditions suddenly deteriorated. Strong winds, choppy water. In a call Brian made 3 days later to his friends Marnie and Blaine Stevenson. A call he didn't realize was being recorded. He used one specific word to describe how Lynette hit the water. He said she bounced. According to his story, Lynette bounced right out of the boat when a sudden 20-knot wind kicked up out of nowhere. He told the police she was wearing the safety lanyard for the engine's kill switch. That safety cord is designed to kill the engine if the pilot goes overboard. When Lynette hit the water, the cord went with her, and the motor died instantly. His own account of that moment was blurred, almost jagged. He claimed to have spotted her only a couple of times through the waves. He insisted that he threw her a floating cushion, one of the ones they used for seating on the boat, right after she fell. He maintained that he tossed her a flotation device. 3 days later, he doubled down on this in a voicemail left for Carly, Lynette's daughter. The voice was calm, chillingly so. He said the rescue team had found the object, which would help narrow the search. He ended with a "love you" and "talk soon." He told police the last thing he saw was his wife swimming toward the shore before the currents grabbed her and she vanished from sight. Without a motor, according to his story, he had no choice but to row the boat back to land. He just drifted. He claims he fired off 2 flares, but says not a single passing ship responded to his signals. It was nearly 4 a.m. when he finally reached the Marsh Harbor boatyard. Between 8 and 8.5 hours had passed since the moment he says Lynette disappeared. The first person Brian encountered was Edward Smith, the security guard working the night shift. Smith remembered Brian looking completely drained and asking for water. When asked point blank where his wife was, Brian simply said she was in the water. At first, Smith didn't suspect a thing. He didn't see anything in the man's behavior that felt out of place. That 8 or 9 hour gap is everything. It's the one question investigators can't seem to solve, the dark heart of the entire case. Brian's story involves oars drifting and flares that nobody saw. Some locals and Bahamian officials noted the sea was particularly rough that night. But the math of that time gap just doesn't add up. It is a cold calculation. A man in a 7-foot boat traveling just a few miles, taking 8 hours to report his wife drowned. That's a detail investigators simply cannot ignore. A friend of the couple, a seasoned sailor, described the boat to the press as a walnut shell, hardly enough power to handle that kind of swell. Blaine Stevenson didn't hold back. He believed the vessel was never meant to handle the way the weather turned that night. Authorities are dissecting those testimonies to test Brian's story about the drift. On April 8th, 4 days after she vanished, the inevitable happened. Bahamian police picked up Brian for another round of questioning. There was, per officials, enough probable cause to bring him in. That afternoon, things got even uglier. During a search of the sailboat, Soulmate under a heavy downpour, Brian Hooker, who was in handcuffs at the time, slipped on the wet deck and plunged into the sea. His life jacket inflated, they hauled him out, and he ended up with a knee injury. His lawyer was quick to point out how dangerous and choppy the water was that night. Police secured a warrant to search the Soulmate for electronics. Tablets, phones, any kind of digital video footprint. The details of that search warrant eventually leaked to the media. The language used to justify it was heavy. Agents were looking for physical evidence tied to a disappearance and potential intentional bodily harm. This wasn't a search for accident reports. They were investigating under the legal framework of a deliberate act. The devices were seized from the boat. Right now, they are under the microscope of digital forensic investigators. They grilled Brian for over 4 hours. A judge then granted a 72-hour extension, set to expire at 7:20 p.m. on April 13, 2026. In the end, the prosecution recommended his release while the investigation continued. Brian Hooker walked out that same night. But he remains a suspect. Both the local police and the United States Coast Guard are keeping their own criminal investigations wide open. Carly Aylesworth is the daughter Lynette had from a previous relationship. Brian is her stepfather. Carly is 28 years old and she's been the loudest voice since the day her mother vanished. She's been everywhere: CNN, NBC, Fox News, and every local station in Michigan. What she describes isn't the perfect marriage we saw on social media. Her doubt regarding Brian's story is as simple as it is haunting. Speaking to CNN, she said she just doesn't get why Brian didn't drop the anchor to stay and look for his wife. She also wondered why he didn't dive in after her, especially as a former Marine. Why row the other way instead? She was blunt: if her partner went over, she'd dive in after him without a second thought. She insisted she'd never just say goodbye. She'd stay right there with him in the middle of the ocean, even if it was just to be together, dead or alive. And Brian Hooker, he's a former Marine. The excuse for not jumping is that the engine was dead and he couldn't maneuver. But the anchor, that's a different story. Carly has a point. The Soulmate was moored at Elbow Cay. A 45-foot sailboat in a quiet anchorage is a fixed point. If the dinghy's motor dies, the logical move is to get back to that fixed point to the Soulmate. There are lights there and communication gear. There's a stable hull and a real chance to call for help. You don't row away from the spot where your wife is drowning. Brian is sticking to his guns with the police. He saw her swimming for shore. He says the currents just grabbed her, and then she was gone. Consider these two specific details: the fact that she was swimming and that she was doing so with a clear sense of purpose. That doesn't square with Lynette Hooker's history. She was essentially raised on the water. According to her mother, she grew up surrounded by lakes and boats, always sailing, always swimming. She wasn't the type to lose her cool at sea. We are talking about a woman who had been a swimmer since childhood and spent years crossing the ocean. She knew exactly how to handle herself on a vessel. One of the big questions investigators are weighing is whether someone with that level of experience could really fail to survive those conditions. The other question, whether an ex-Marine would just stand by and watch an expert swimmer go under without diving in. Her daughter told NBC she finds it hard to believe. Lynette simply fell. She added that even if she had fallen, she couldn't understand why Brian didn't drop the anchor to search for her, or why he didn't jump in to pull her out. He was a Marine. The story just doesn't hold water. When NBC asked if she thought it was an accident, she was blunt. She said if something happened that night, she was convinced it had been planned in advance. Planned. That's not a word you use lightly. It carries a very specific weight. This isn't just someone saying I have my doubts, or something feels off. It's the term you use when you believe a choice was made beforehand. Something premeditated. Carly grew up observing this man. For years, she had a front-row seat to her mother's relationship with him, a cycle defined by constant breakups. When she uses the word planned, she's speaking from what she knows, not from headlines. She told Fox News that Brian had choked her mother before and threatened to throw her overboard. And then she dropped a detail that hasn't really caught the media's attention yet. She claimed she had seen Brian choke one of his own daughters in the past, a situation that apparently led to a court case. In her eyes, he's just repeating a pattern. She also told CNN that in January of 2026, just 3 months before the disappearance, her mother confessed that during a fight back in 2024, Brian had threatened to toss her off the boat. To the daughter, the fact that this is all coming out now meant there was much more to the story than the official version. A specific threat, on a specific boat, delivered directly from Lynette to her daughter. No middlemen, no generalities, just the cold truth. 3 months before April 4th, Brian Hooker's attorney flatly denied these claims, stating her client is innocent. In his own interviews after being released, Brian insisted he would never hurt Lynette. He claimed his only job, his only duty, was to look after her, and he failed. He stated publicly that he had never harmed her, and never would. He kept repeating that his only priority was finding her. He claimed she was his entire life, that they were made for each other. Let's pause for a second. If this kind of analysis is something you value, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the updates. We analyze open investigations here, using only verified facts. The content is updated as each case moves forward. Your support ensures cases like Lynette Hooker's aren't forgotten. Give this a like if you want to follow this search to the very end. There are text messages Lynette sent to her friend Marnie Stevenson in early 2024. It was during that brief time the couple was separated. Steve Hansen, Carly's boyfriend, confirmed they were apart for a couple of months before they reconciled. In those chats, Lynette acknowledged they had been married for 21 years, but noted that their marriage at sea had only lasted 6 weeks of travel. She described it as horrific. She told her friend she couldn't be out there with him. When Marnie asked if she'd go back to Brian, Lynette said no. They had decided to end it. She wasn't planning on going back. Marnie and her husband, Blaine Stevenson, are the same friends Brian called 3 days after Lynette went missing. It was a call he didn't realize was being recorded. They are all part of the same boating community. Marnie kept those 2024 messages and handed them over to CBS News after the disappearance. That idyllic world the hookers showcased on social media. It's now part of the evidence regarding what happened when the cameras were off. It's worth remembering what the Stevensons said early on about the night of April 4th. They were among the first people in the nautical circle who truly knew the hookers. Blaine Stevenson told News Nation he was frustrated by the lack of information coming from the Bahamian police. He recorded the April 7th call with Brian because he needed the specific coordinates Brian was mentioning. He wasn't familiar with the geography of the Abaco Islands and wanted to provide precise details to the rescue teams. He thought the local sailing community which knows those waters could judge if Brian's story matched the actual state of the sea. Marnie Stevenson, for her part, released a video with Blaine stating they were doing everything possible to find Lynette. They weren't throwing around public accusations. They were just offering up what they had. Every text and voice note they exchanged has become a fragment of a larger, darker puzzle, one that investigators are still trying to assemble. Lynette went back to Brian after sending those messages. She returned to the soulmate, back to her supposed better half. Looking back with the cold clarity of hindsight, that choice fits a pattern domestic violence experts have documented 1,000 times. It's a relentless loop of leaving and returning, fueled by a poisonous mix of emotional ties and financial survival. Coupled with a genuine hope that things might finally change. Sometimes it is simply the terror of what leaving might trigger. It is not weakness. We are looking at one of the most consistent dynamics in abusive cycles. This is exactly why Darlene Hamlet's fear was so specific and so persistent. Darlene told reporters that Lynette kept a secret stash of photos showing her injuries. Not as evidence for the cops, but as anchors for herself. Photos of the moments he choked her, of the deep bruising covering her back. She captured those images to keep herself grounded in reality. For the times when Brian played the charmer, the sea was calm and their life looked perfect. Lynette needed something to look at, so she wouldn't forget that another version of that man existed. A much darker, hidden version. She'd built a private archive of her own trauma. A defense mechanism against her own natural optimism. Darlene also admitted she'd been calling women's shelters desperately seeking advice on how to pull Brian and Lynette apart for good. Picture a woman of 76, calling domestic violence hotlines, just trying to figure out how to help her grown daughter escape a marriage. She described Brian as a man with two distinct warring personalities, someone genuinely pleasant when he was sober, and someone cruel, full of vitriol. And physically lethal once the alcohol took hold. According to her, Brian would say things that were truly vile. That was the man's other side. He eventually crossed into physical violence, too. She believed she understood exactly what triggered the appearance of each of his two versions. This is the kind of insight you only get after years of watching from the shadows. From middle-of-the-night calls. From the grim photographs stored on a phone. Carly Aylesworth also described the relationship to the press as volatile, a history of constant fighting, especially when the drinking started. This mirrors Darlene's account of the alcohol perfectly. It also aligns with the patterns identified systematically by investigators of intimate partner violence. Alcohol consumption isn't the root cause of the abuse itself, but it's often the catalyst creating the specific environment where the most lethal version of an abuser is finally unleashed. The 25 years Lynette Hooker spent in that relationship weren't a constant scream. It was a cyclical, grinding violence. Good stretches, genuine warmth and real love, according to witnesses, followed by something that required photos to remember and shelters to survive. And then, about a month before Lynette vanished from the face of the earth, she bought a one-way ticket to Florida back to her mother's house. She was done with the Bahamas, leaving that boat behind. That ticket was never scanned. 3 weeks after her scheduled flight was supposed to take off, they pulled her body from the water. Darlene confessed something to a reporter. She admitted that given her daughter and son-in-law's lifestyle, she had been mentally preparing for the call for a very long time. She said every time Lynette boarded a plane or returned to that boat, she feared it was the last time. They asked if she'd ever actually shared that specific fear with her daughter directly. Darlene admitted that she personally had never done it, but she added that her husband had. This isn't a mother exaggerating or inventing tragedies. This is something much more grounded and grim. This is a woman with precise documented information about what was actually happening on the Soulmate when the world wasn't watching. Darlene Hamlet sat down for an extensive interview to detail the events. She spoke with the same journalist who has been tracking this specific case from the very first minute. That conversation was far longer and much more graphic than any of the brief television appearances we'd seen before this. During that talk, Darlene recounted one specific night on the Soulmate. It wasn't a vague description. It was a detailed event with terrifyingly precise physical details. The kitchen area on the Soulmate, the dining spot below the deck, has a bench that wraps around the main table. Darlene described what happened on that bench with a level of detail that only comes from a daughter confessing a trauma to her mother. Brian threw Lynette against that bench. He pinned her down. He began to squeeze the life out of her. As the pressure mounted, Lynette felt something inside her neck literally crack. She spent a long time after that with a stiff neck, her mother recalled. That night, despite the attack, Lynette stayed on the boat. Darlene says she still can't explain why she didn't run. And the very next morning, the morning after he choked her, until her neck cracked, Brian Hooker sat across from his wife in that same kitchen and told her what he wished he'd finished the night before. To this day, nobody can quite explain why she chose to stay on that boat after that. The next morning, they both gathered up the last of her things. He actually helped her carry her entire life down to the dock. For a while, she stayed at her mother's house, trying to find some peace. But there was a conversation. One they had on that boat that very morning. He admitted to her with a terrifying lack of emotion that he regretted not finishing the job. He told her he wished he'd just thrown her overboard. He said it again. He truly wished he had finished what he started and just dumped her into the sea. Let's look at the actual logic of that sentence for a moment. Forget the feeling behind it, just look at the mechanics of the words. To finish the job implies by definition that something had already begun. It suggests that what happened the night before, on that kitchen bench, the choking, the sound of her neck cracking, was viewed by him as nothing more than a task left half done. A beginning without a conclusion. And the specific ending he had in mind, throwing her over the rail off the boat and into the dark water. That is the exact way Lynette Hooker vanished on April 4th in 2026. Almost 18 months after those specific words were first spoken. Prosecutors on the case, along with investigators from the Royal Bahamas Police Force and the United States Coast Guard, are looking for one thing. Is there a direct link between what was said on that boat and the story Brian Hooker eventually told the police about that day in April? Stating a clear intention, detailing a specific method, and doing it on the very vessel where someone disappears, that is massive evidence. You don't need a body for that to be vital. You just need one witness willing to get on the stand and swear to what they heard. And Darlene Hamlet has already done that. Publicly, on camera, under her own name. That threat to throw Lynette into the sea wasn't just a one-time thing after the kitchen fight. According to the statements Carly Aylesworth gave to Fox News, the idea of tossing her overboard was something Brian had mentioned on several different occasions. Carly said there was a history of these threats. History. Plural. A repetitive pattern of behavior. Not just a single moment of losing his temper. That word history carries the full weight of the situation. It's the word someone uses when they've watched a toxic cycle repeat itself. When Lynette told Carly about it in January of 2026, just 3 months before she disappeared, she mentioned that Brian had already threatened to throw her in the water during a fight back in 2024. For the family, this wasn't a surprise. It was just the latest time he'd said something that had clearly become a habit. This leads to a question worth thinking about. When a threat is repeated for years, in the same place, and against the same person, is it still a threat? Or is it a mission statement? Give us your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you think about this specific piece of the puzzle. The background of that threat, the fact it was said more than once, and that the victim reported it to her family, who saw it as something very real and very specific. This is exactly the kind of pattern evidence prosecutors use to prove intent and premeditation, when there is no physical evidence available. Brian Hooker lived side by side with Lynette on the Soulmate for years. They'd been living on that boat for 4 years when she vanished. That was their home. The kitchen where he allegedly strangled her was the same place they ate their dinner. And the water hitting the side of the boat was the place Brian confessed he wished he had left her. We aren't talking about a stranger making threats in a random place. This is the most intimate, claustrophobic environment imaginable. Two people stuck in 14 meters of space, where the only exit is the ocean. And inside those walls, he only talked about putting her in that ocean. The fact she finally ended up in that sea with him as the only witness is why those words are now the heart of two active criminal investigations. Those were the words that echoed through the soulmate. Spoken directly to Lynette Hooker's face. Uttered 18 months before she fell from a dinghy while returning to that boat, with only her husband there to see her go. That same boat has since been searched by police with a warrant. Its electronics are now in the hands of forensic experts. Everything comes back to that threat of dumping her in the water recorded in memory long before it happened. Brian Hooker hasn't said a word about this in any of his interviews since his release. His lawyer's blanket denial covers it all for now. But Darlene Hamlet told the story herself, in a public interview. She spoke as a mother who had to hear that terrifying account from her own daughter. It's part of the public record now. It can't be unsaid. And the prosecutors in both jurisdictions haven't forgotten it. There is also another incident, something that happened in 2015 in Kentwood, Michigan. That time, both Brian and Lynette were involved. And they gave stories that were completely opposite. Brian told the officers that Lynette had punched him in the face over and over. His nose was visibly swollen and covered in blood. Brian claimed that Lynette had struck his face repeatedly. He showed off a nose that was smashed and dripping with blood. A witness backs it up. There was the sound of a violent struggle, then Brian was seen coming down with a bloodied nose. Lynette didn't mince words with the officers. He tried to strangle her, she said, beating her with genuine malice. The police report painted a different picture, describing her as highly intoxicated. Oddly enough, it was Lynette who spent that night behind bars. Back then, the officers didn't document a single visible mark on Lynette's body. Not one bruise was recorded. This 2015 incident suggests a murky dynamic. It reveals a marriage where volatility swung like a pendulum depending on the day. Darlene Hamlet herself was blunt about it. Their relationship was a roller coaster of extremes. When things were good, it felt like a dream. But when it soured, it was hell. That report from 2015 with its conflicting stories and Lynette's arrest is a vital piece of the puzzle. The fact they took her, and not Brian, says something. Official records often fail to capture the grim reality of what happens behind closed doors. That night, Lynette's story fell on deaf ears. She insisted he had tried to choke her out. But that wasn't the version that made it into the legal outcome. That 2015 incident was just the first brick. More followed. One by one. Fast forward to 2024. Lynette texts a friend. Everything is getting worse, she says. She couldn't stand being trapped there with him anymore. That same year, Brian made a death threat during a blowout fight. He told her he'd throw her overboard. Lynette told her daughter about it, absolutely terrified. By early 2026, Lynette bought a one-way ticket home. A flight she never boarded. This was about 18 months before the soulmate incident. Brian had crushed his wife's throat until something gave way. The next morning, with stone-cold indifference, he told her he regretted not just tossing her into the ocean then and there. And that brings us to the critical date, April 4th, 2026. Lynette Hooker falls from a raft. Her husband is the only witness. The body is still missing. Those are the facts we have today. Whether this ever reaches a courtroom is a different story. It all hinges on what surfaces from here on out. It depends on what's hidden in the electronics pulled from the boat. And if the ocean finally decides to give Lynette back, we'll see if a joint investigation between two nations can build a real case. For now, Brian Hooker and his lawyer deny everything, flat out. No charges have been filed yet. The law needs more than a pile of suspicions to put a man away. But here's the thing. The law doesn't force us to look the other way and pretend this isn't happening while we wait for answers. Take a close look at the search warrant text. It's a detail worth another glance. To invade someone's privacy, police need hard facts. Hunches don't cut it. They have to sell a judge on specific data. The magistrate who signed off on searching the soulmate read the evidence and saw something. They ruled that those digital devices might hold proof of a serious felony injury against a missing person. That's not the kind of language you use for a simple accident. It points to a much darker police theory. that someone did something to Lynette Hooker on purpose. A warrant isn't a guilty verdict, obviously, but it tells us the police were taking this dead seriously, even long before Brian Hooker walked free. We don't know what's buried in that digital memory yet. Video recorders, tablets, and phones were all seized. 4 years of living on that boat leaves a massive digital footprint. Everything they recorded or wrote is sitting right there. GPS positions call logs, personal photos and videos, a data goldmine. Everything that happened in the weeks and days leading up to April 4th is now under the microscope. Will there be something that finally lets them charge, Brian? That's a question only the investigators can answer right now. And for the moment, they are staying completely silent. The warrant was served, the gear is gone. Right now, forensic experts are combing through every bit of data from the soulmate to see what they find. Before we wrap up, there's one last detail in the file that needs to be laid out clearly. Just after Lynette vanished and before his arrest, Brian Hooker posted a public statement on Facebook. In those lines, he played the heartbroken husband. He wrote about treacherous seas and winds that swept his beloved Lynette right off the raft. According to his story, he tried desperately to save her while they were near the Bahamas. He claimed the current pulled them apart, and that finding her was his only thought. To him, it was just a tragic boating accident. He used phrases like unpredictable seas and heavy winds, talked about his own heroic efforts to reach her. Those were the words he chose to etch into the public record before the investigators put him in handcuffs. That's the framework he's built his entire defense on. But veteran investigators don't just look at the facade, they look behind it. They dig into the shadows. And right now, behind that frame, there's a search warrant, 2 open criminal probes, and a mountain of doubt. There are seized devices and the testimony of a 76-year-old woman. She claims Brian admitted he wished he'd finished the job. Lynette Hooker was 55. She was a mother. And today she's still out there lost somewhere in the ocean. She was a daughter of the sea, having spent decades on the deck. It's haunting then that her final chapter was seemingly written right there in the middle of the ocean. Her last update on March 29th. Just days before she vanished, she was docked at Marsh Harbor. That is the exact same port Brian pulled into by dinghy in the early hours of April 5th, and where the soulmate has been under a microscope ever since. Crime scene photos. Every inch searched from top to bottom. Investigators with warrants have kept the boat on lockdown. To Lynette, writing from that deck, it was just another anchorage. She said the rain and the Abaco Sea were just pure entertainment. She had no way of knowing those exact coordinates would eventually mark the spot where she simply disappeared. Darlene Hamlet sat down for an interview and kept her message to her daughter painfully simple, that she loved her, and that she just wished she'd come home. Nothing more. Just a simple "I love you." And that longing for her return. The one-way ticket Lynette bought was supposed to bring her back, but she never got to use it. It is that one detail more than any other piece of this puzzle that keeps Lynette's family awake at night. Brian Hooker is still a key suspect in an investigation that is very much alive. Police confirmed his release was at the prosecutor's request. A move dictated by the need for more evidence. Make no mistake, it was not an exoneration. Parallel to all this, the United States Coast Guard's Criminal Division is running its own independent probe. Experts are currently analyzing electronics taken from the soulmate. Still no sign of Lynette, and for now the courtroom remains empty. But there is a public record. A recording where Lynette's mother doesn't hide behind anonymity. She speaks her truth clearly. She recalls a man telling his wife he should have finished the job by tossing her overboard. This happened 18 months before she actually went into the water. Brian Hooker has stayed silent on those specific words, at least for now. The investigation is wide open. Meanwhile, the soulmate sits there bobbing slowly in the harbor waters. When the Coast Guard steps in like this, it's a detail the media often misses. This isn't a search and rescue mission. It's a criminal case. A legal track moving at the same pace as the work being done by the Bahamian authorities. This means 2 different law enforcement agencies in 2 jurisdictions are building separate files. The Bahamas takes the lead, obviously. It happened in their backyard. But when an American disappears in international waters nearby, the Coast Guard has the right to act. And they have. No matter what the Bahamian prosecutors decide, the American investigation is on its own trajectory. Brian Hooker isn't just dealing with one legal headache he can brush off. He's fighting on 2 fronts. It's worth looking back at what Brian said after he walked free. It's part of the record now. He told CBS that he'd never stop looking for her. Impossible, he said. He claimed only a higher power could make him quit the search. On camera, he looked like a broken man. He told NBC that Lynette was his entire life, they belonged to each other. To other reporters, he said his only job was protecting her. And he failed. From that moment on, he promised to keep watch over her memory the only way he knew how. He initially said he'd stay in the Bahamas to help search. But days after his release, he was gone. He headed back to the States, citing his mother's health. That's the image Brian projected after leaving his cell. Whether that was genuine grief or something else is anyone's guess. But Darlene Hamlet's accusations are still hanging in the air right next to his words, waiting for an answer. The same man, vowing to never give up on his wife, is the one being pointed at by her mother. She didn't whisper it. She said it right to the camera. She claims he admitted he wished he'd dumped her in the ocean already. Both stories are recorded. Both are on the detectives' desks. The real question is how these two stories connect. That's what investigators in two countries are trying to figure out. I want to hear your take on this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you buy Brian's story? Or does the history leading up to April 4th change how you see that night? Those threats allegedly made on the boat 18 months prior. What do they mean to you? With two active criminal probes and Brian still under the spotlight, what's the next move? For those following this since day one, what's the one detail you can't stop thinking about? Let me know in the comments. Every perspective helps as we track the updates on this case. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of the fact regarding Lynette Hooker, please like and subscribe. I stick to verified records and official statements here. No baseless theories or wild guesses. Just the hard evidence and what people have said on the record. Toggle those notifications. You'll want to be here as this case finally begins to yield its darker secrets. Lynette Hooker's family deserves more than silence. Your engagement is the only thing keeping this case from fading away. We hold space for her. And for those left behind still waiting for the truth. Still hoping for a forensic reconstruction of exactly what transpired on those remote Abaco Islands. Thank you for staying through to the end. If a specific detail is still bothering you, leave a comment. Your insight could be the one that breaks the case wide open. Until the next case file.